The distant hum of the auction hall barely registered as Cash and Rivers surveyed the crowd. The low lighting bathed the room in amber, casting long shadows over the extravagant displays of alien technology, star maps, and various trinkets from across the galaxy. He hadn't come for the glitz. No, Cashin wasn't here for the pomp of high society. He was here for the ship. And not just any ship, a battle-worn relic, part of an ancient fleet rumored to have connections with the most dangerous underground club in the universe. Cashin's fingers tightened around the edge of his bidder's card, his heart thumping with anticipation. The price was outrageous, but desperation made everything affordable. His business was on the brink, the debts piling up faster than the profits ever had. If he could just get his hands on this ship, he'd have the leverage he needed to turn everything around. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd as the host announced the next lot, a ship that had been parked at the edge of the galaxy, hidden away for years. It wasn't the ship itself that intrigued everyone, it was what was rumored to be aboard. Cashin's pulse quickened as the dark velvet curtains parted to reveal a sleek, jet-black spacecraft. Its surface was pocked with scars of battle, its silhouette both elegant and ominous. The auctioneer's voice rose. The buyer of this vessel will not only claim a piece of galactic history but also unlock the mysteries of the most coveted prize aboard. A woman, a dancer, kept in suspended animation until her purpose is realized. A strange chill crawled down Cashin's spine as his eyes locked onto the ship. There were rumors of women like her, sold into slavery under the guise of a dancing contract. Most were disposable, tools of pleasure in the secretive adult HFY clubs hidden in the deepest corners of the galaxy. But Cashin hadn't made it this far by playing by the rules. He had his own plans for her. He raised his card in a fluid motion, signaling his bid. The room hushed, eyes flicking toward him as the stakes rose. The auctioneer nodded approvingly, but Cashin barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed with the idea of that ship, that woman, and the secret he needed to uncover. Minutes passed in tense silence before the gavel fell. Sold! To bidder number 7! Cashin's heart pounded as he stood, nodding curtly to the auctioneer. The deal was made, and now the real work began. He could already feel the sweat on his palms, but there was no turning back. As the crowd dispersed, Cashin made his way toward the back of the hall, where the ship was being prepped for departure. The air was thick with the scent of high-end cigars and perfume, blending into something artificial, suffocating. He stepped onto the vessel's metallic ramp, greeted by a few crew members who offered brief nods of acknowledgement. None of them seemed to understand what he had just acquired, but Cashin felt the weight of it pressing against him like a ticking clock. Inside, the ship was colder than he expected, sterile and efficient, the walls gleaming with a soft blue light. A small control room greeted him first, but it was the door leading deeper into the craft that caught his attention. It was locked, of course, but the code was something Cashin had acquired days earlier, from a source whose loyalty came with the price. He entered the code, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. A dimly lit chamber unfolded before him, filled with strange, glowing pods. The temperature dropped further as Cashin approached the largest pod. Inside, a woman lay motionless, her figure suspended in a deep sleep that had seemingly lasted for years. Her long silver hair cascaded across the crystal surface of the pod, her skin as pale as moonlight. Her features were sharp, almost ethereal, too perfect, too unreal. Cashin's breath hitched as he gazed at her. "She's beautiful," he murmured, almost involuntarily. The soft hum of machinery filled the silence as Cashin approached. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't what he had imagined. The rumors had spoken of a dancer, a prized possession for the right buyer, but Cashin felt something stir inside him, something darker than desire. The woman's eyes opened. Cashin froze, his breath catching in his throat. She wasn't just awake, she was alert, aware of him, of the situation. She blinked slowly, her gaze focused, her pupils dilating as her senses sharpened. Without a word, she moved gracefully, the pod opening as if it had been waiting for her. Cashin stepped back instinctively. "Who are you?" She tilted her head, a soft smile curling on her lips. I am a dancer. But now, I am something far more. Her voice was like silk, rich and smooth, yet heavy with something unspoken. Cassian swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. What's your name? He asked, though part of him was already certain he wasn't ready for the answer. She stepped closer, her presence filling the room with an intensity he hadn't prepared for. I have many names, she said. But you may call me Seraph. The name echoed in his mind, and for a moment, Cassian felt something twist inside of him. This wasn't just a transaction anymore. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was far more than he had bargained for. And suddenly, he realized that this gamble was no longer just about saving his business. It was about saving himself. Cassian paced in the confines of the ship's command room, his thoughts a tangled mess of unanswered questions and growing unease. Seraph's presence lingered in the air like an electric charge, unseen but undeniably powerful. Her eyes, those piercing, silver orbs, had haunted him since the moment she'd awoken, their depths promising secrets he wasn't sure he was ready to understand. He had purchased the ship, yes? But with it, he'd inherited a labyrinth of debts and mysteries he hadn't accounted for. The ship had once belonged to an underground organization, a black market empire dealing in everything from weapons to illicit pleasures. But that was the tip of the iceberg. What troubled him more was the woman. Seraph. The door to the command room slid open with a smooth hiss. Seraph stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. Her movements were fluid, like water slipping through cracks, graceful yet unsettling. You're still here, Cassian muttered, half to himself. The truth was, he hadn't expected her to stay. But there she was, standing before him, with a look that could burn through any pretense he might have had. I have nowhere else to go, she replied, her voice low but edged with something that made his stomach tighten. Not yet. Cassian's gaze flicked to the control panel in the corner. He had yet to learn the full extent of the ship's capabilities, how much of it was still operational after years of neglect. But in that moment, the ship felt like a stranger's skin, foreign and unfathomable. Why me? Cassian asked, finally turning to face her fully. The question had been gnawing at him since they'd crossed paths. Why had she been placed in this ship? Why had she awoken for him, of all people? Seraph's lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile. You're the one who bought me, Cassian. Not the other way around. Her words were a challenge, not a question, and it stung more than he'd like to admit. She stepped closer, her proximity igniting the space between them. His breath hitched. There was something dangerous in her aura, something that pulled at his own darker urges, threatening to unravel him. I didn't buy you, he replied, his voice tight. I bought the ship. You're not stupid, she said, her voice suddenly low and knowing. You knew what you were getting into. You knew there was more to the deal than the ship. And you knew who I was long before that gavel dropped. Cassian's pulse quickened. He was used to being in control, accustomed to holding the reins. Yet here, with her, every instinct screamed that he was completely out of his depth. Seraph stepped closer again, her hand brushing his as she moved past him. The heat from her skin lingered, igniting something inside him he couldn't explain. I'm not your property, Cassian. I'm no one's to own. I am a contract, a currency in a game that you're only beginning to understand. Her words hung in the air like smoke. Cassian watched her with wariness, but also something else, something darker, something he couldn't name. She was a puzzle he hadn't even begun to solve, and every moment spent in her presence seemed to unravel another thread of his own self-discipline. I never asked for this, he muttered, shaking his head. But he knew it was a lie. He'd asked for all of it. His curiosity had led him here, and now he was trapped in a game far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Seraph paused, her gaze sweeping over the ship's control room. You didn't ask, no? But you were always meant to find me, Cassian. And now that you have, you'll find yourself entangled in more than you bargained for. She was close enough now that Cassian could smell the faint trace of jasmine and something else, something exotic, almost metallic. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, the heat of her presence making his pulse thrum in his ears. He forced himself to take a step back, trying to regain some semblance of control. "What's your game?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Seraph tilted her head, her silver eyes narrowing slightly, as if considering whether to tell him the truth. "The game, Cassian, is not mine to play alone." Her hand brushed his again, this time lingering for a moment longer. "But you're already playing." Cassian's throat tightened, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the universe pressing down on him. His thoughts raced, battling with the emotions that surged through him. She was right. He was already too deep. A soft chime from the control panel interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Cassian glanced at the screen, which had flickered to life, displaying a flashing red alert. A digital message scrolled across the screen. Warning, unauthorized entry detected. Ship's defense systems engaged. Cassian froze, the air around him growing thick with tension. He met Seraph's gaze. The playful smirk had disappeared, replaced by something far colder. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Nothing," she said, though the glint in her eyes suggested otherwise. "But I think someone's come to claim what's theirs." The ship suddenly lurched, its engines roaring to life with a violent shudder. Cassian gripped the edge of the console, barely able to steady himself as the ship was pulled out of its dock. There was no turning back now. The game had begun in earnest. And Cassian was right in the middle of it. Cassian gripped the edge of the control panel, his knuckles white against the cold metal. The ship's engines roared to life with a primal urgency, the sound vibrating through his bones as the hull vibrated violently. He had barely registered the warning alarms before the ship shot forward, its autopilot kicking in with a brutal efficiency. The warning lights blinked, bathing the room in a harsh, red glow. "What's happening?" he demanded, turning to Seraph. Her presence, always unsettling, felt amplified now, a quiet storm that threatened to break loose at any moment. She stood by the door, calm in the chaos, as though she had known this was coming. Her eyes flickered toward him, a flash of something unreadable crossing her features. She didn't move a muscle as the ship shuddered under the stress of acceleration. "You bought more than you bargained for, Cassian," Seraph said, her voice like honeyed steel. "You knew the ship wasn't just a relic. It was an asset, a weapon, and now, it's calling home." Cassian's heart skipped a beat. Home? The word felt out of place, too soft for the situation, but he could hear the underlying truth in her tone. This wasn't just a ship. This was a gateway, a key to something far larger, something hidden in the shadows of the universe. "What the hell is going on?" Cassian's voice was strained now, his grip tightening around the controls. "I'm not a fool, Seraph. I didn't sign up for this." Her gaze softened slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "No, but you're here now, and you're the one who awoke the system. There's no turning back." She was right. Cassian had been in over his head from the moment he'd laid eyes on the ship, but hearing the finality in her words, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real game was only beginning. A sudden jolt threw him forward, and the ship's intercom blared, a crackling voice cutting through the tension. "Unauthorized vessel approaching. Defensive protocols initiated. Prepare for battle." Cassian's blood ran cold as he looked at Seraph. "Defensive protocols? You've got to be kidding me." Seraph didn't flinch. "It's not the first time they've tried to reclaim what they lost." "Who?" Cassian's voice was tight with disbelief, the question hanging in the air between them. "The people who own this ship," she said. "The ones who built it and used it to control the underworld." Her eyes narrowed, a shadow passing over her expression. "The ones who think they can still control me." Cassian turned back to the viewport. In the distance, a massive, dark silhouette emerged from the void. A ship, sleek and menacing, cutting through space like a predator closing in on its prey. The shapes and contours of the vessel were unfamiliar, alien. But there was something about it that felt personal. Like it had been made for one thing, and one thing only, to reclaim what it lost. He swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the information. He thought himself prepared for a deal like this. but he was out of his depth. And now, with an unknown enemy on his tail, the weight of the decision he made crashed over him. Seraph was still by the door, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. "You've awoken something, Cassian. You think you bought a ship? But you've taken something far more dangerous." "What do you mean?" Cassian's voice was tight, his mind racing. There was more to this ship, more to Seraph, than he had initially realized. And he was beginning to understand that it had been a mistake to think this was just a simple transaction. "The ship is connected to a network of power brokers, cartels, and weapons dealers," Seraph said, her voice low. "But it's also a prison. A place where people like me were kept, trapped, forced to dance, to perform. And now they'll come for me. And for you." Cassian looked at her, his pulse quickening. "You're telling me you're not just some—" He broke off, unable to finish the sentence. There was no denying that Seraph was more than a prisoner. She was something far more complex, something he couldn't understand. Her eyes flicked toward him, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the edges of her lips. "What do you think I am, Cassian? A slave? A tool for your pleasure?" Her voice dripped with disdain, but beneath it, he could hear the pain, the years of torment wrapped in her words. "No," he muttered. "I never thought that." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze cutting through him like a blade. "No. You never did. But now you've brought this into your life. And there's no going back." The ship jerked again, and Cassian stumbled, reaching out to steady himself against the console. "Brace for impact." A cold, automated voice rang out from the ship's systems. "Get to the weapon systems," Seraph commanded, her tone sharp and focused. "We can't outrun them. But we can fight." Cassian's mind was reeling. He had no idea how to use any of the ship's weapons, no idea how to defend against what was coming. But one thing was clear, he was trapped, and this fight was his only way out. "Show me how," Cassian said, his voice low but resolute. Seraph didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, her steps fluid and sure, her confidence almost disarming. "This ship is my legacy, Cassian. You'll learn fast. The stakes are too high for anything less." She moved toward the weapons panel, and Cassian followed, adrenaline beginning to cut through the confusion. As she worked the controls, he watched her, his thoughts clouded by the closeness of her presence, the way her fingers danced over the systems with familiarity. Then the ship shuddered again, and a new voice broke through the tension. "Warning, shields at 40%. Cassian swallowed. "What the hell are we facing?" Seraph glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "The worst of them all." The alarms blared in a chorus of relentless urgency, the ship's warning lights flashing in violent strobe patterns. Cassian's chest tightened with every passing second. He could feel the weight of the enemy ship's presence now, looming just outside their vessel's vulnerable hull like a dark storm ready to swallow them whole. He gripped the weapons console, his hands shaking despite his best efforts to remain composed. Seraph had disappeared into the depths of the ship, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around them. Every moment spent in her presence only served to remind him how out of place he was. But now, he was all she had, and she was the only thing standing between him and the void. "You're not ready for this." Her voice came through the comms, her tone sharp but oddly comforting amidst the chaos. "I didn't ask for this." Cassian shot back, his frustration boiling over as he adjusted the weapon's targeting systems. "But I'm here. So tell me what to do, Seraph." There was a pause, a beat of silence that seemed to stretch on forever. He could hear the sounds of machinery whirring, of systems coming online as Seraph worked her way through the inner workings of the ship. The hum of her movements echoed through the calm, steady and precise. "Lock on to their main reactor," she instructed, her voice laced with authority. "If we hit them there, it'll be enough to cripple their systems. We don't need to destroy them, just disable them long enough to make our escape." Cassian's fingers hovered over the control panel, but a sickening feeling gnawed at him. "And then what?" "Then we run," Seraph replied simply, as though the answer was obvious. "Trust me, Cassian. You'll want to run." Cassian clenched his jaw. He didn't like it, didn't like the thought of retreating, of leaving the danger unresolved. But deep down, he knew Seraph was right. He wasn't equipped to fight this battle, not yet. His instincts were pushing him toward the escape route, and he had no choice but to follow them. With a deep breath, he punched in the command to lock onto the enemy ship's reactor. His hands trembled as he adjusted the targeting systems, his heart thudding in his chest as he prepared to fire. The seconds felt like hours, each tick of the clock counting down toward their inevitable confrontation. Suddenly, a jarring sound split the air, a deep mechanical groan vibrating through the ship's frame. Cassian's breath caught as he glanced at the status monitor. Shields were down to 10%. Damn it! He hissed. He slammed a fist onto the console in frustration, willing the ship to hold together just a little longer. We're running out of time, he muttered under his breath. The comms crackled again, and Seraph's voice came through, quieter this time. Cassian, listen to me. You can do this. But if you hesitate, if you doubt yourself, you'll die. And I will, too. The raw intensity in her words hit him like a physical blow, a weight of responsibility and truth that settled deep in his gut. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. This wasn't about business, or survival, or even escape. It was about her. His heart raced, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. The stakes had always been higher than he'd ever imagined. But now, in this moment, he knew there was no turning back. He wasn't going to abandon her, not after everything. Cassian's fingers flew over the console, steady now, focused. With a deep exhale, he engaged the weapons systems. The targeting reticule locked on, the crosshairs narrowing over the enemy ship's main reactor. He hesitated for just a moment, then fired. The ship jolted violently as the blast hit its mark, a brilliant flash of light erupting from the enemy's hull. The sensors screamed at him, warning of imminent danger. The shockwave rattled the ship, shaking it to its core. Shields are failing! Cassian shouted into the comm, but the words felt hollow, useless in the face of the attack. He could feel the ship's systems crumbling around him, like a dam on the verge of breaking. But Seraph's voice was the calm in the storm. It's done! They're not following us anymore. We've bought ourselves time. Cassian blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with her words. He looked at the viewport, watching as the enemy vessel slowly veered off, its weapons now offline, floating aimlessly in the void. We're free? Cassian's voice was hoarse, disbelief creeping into his words. For now, Seraph said, her tone cryptic, but there was a softness to it now, something he hadn't heard before. We have time. But you should know something. Cassian stood frozen, waiting for her to continue. I'm not the only one they've been hunting, Seraph said, the weight of her confession heavy between them. I was never just a dancer, Cassian. I was a tool, part of something much larger. The people who controlled me, they want more than the ship. They want me back. Cassian's mind raced as the implications of her words sank in. The fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something far more dangerous than he had ever realized. She wasn't just a victim of a cruel system, she was a key player in a much bigger game, and now that he had taken her in, he was a target, too. What do we do now? His voice was low, his mind still processing everything he had learned. Seraph looked at him then, her silver eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. Now we fight for our freedom. The ship rocked once more, but this time it wasn't the enemy, it was a new presence. A sudden jolt of energy, as if the very fabric of space had shifted around them. Cassian's breath caught, and he glanced toward the viewport again, his heart dropping into his stomach. A new ship appeared on the horizon, its silhouette cutting through the darkness like a shadow that had been waiting for them. And this time, Cassian realized, they might not be able to escape.